Hello everyone, and welcome back to the History of Africa podcast. I'm your host, Andy. Last episode, we explored Kilwa during a sad period of intermittent destruction and ruin. Following a brutal sack by the Portuguese, the island quickly freed itself from direct Portuguese rule through a series of political machinations. In the end, Portugal decided that ruling the island directly was too much of a pain, and Kilwa's leaders began the long process of trying to revive their status as a major trade hub and political power center, only to get overrun and sacked again, this time by the mainland empire of Maravi. Now in smoldering ruins and its economic progress reversed, the Sultanate of Kilwa enters into its twilight years. However, it turns out that the last chapter of Kilwa's history will not be bookended by the arrival of a conquering power from Europe, but rather an entirely different entity from across the sea. Kilwa will not go into that last night easily, and will till the very end struggle to make itself back into that important power it once was. Today we witness the rise of Africa's forgotten colonial power, and see how the nascent emergence of the Omani overseas empire impacts Kilwa Kisiwani. Season 6, Episode 18, The Omani Colonial Empire. Colonialism is a loaded word. It evokes a very strong reaction, especially in the case of African history. The subject of colonialism is basically impossible to escape in African historiography, and for good reason. This subject focuses largely on the domination of the continent by European colonial powers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and this era often ends up dominating discussions of African history. While this show tries to focus on subjects in pre-colonial Africa, the fact that we even offer that designation of pre-colonial is quite telling. In fact, until relatively recently, periodization of African history was almost exclusively centered around that topic, with pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial often being the only historiographical periods recognized in African historical studies. Yes, for many years, the entirety of how we understood African history was centered around its temporal relationship with colonialism. Now, I am very happy to report that this has long since started to change, and academic history has started to develop a more nuanced and regional understanding of African periodization. Turns out, cramming everything from the ancient past to the 1800s under the same pre-colonial umbrella with no subdivisions is just as unhelpful as useful. However, there is also a reason why the period of colonialism has such a prominent place in African historiography. After all, we're living in a world where the history of European colonialism still looms large in Africa. If you examine the borders of modern African states, you'll clearly see how they were shaped by the European colonial borders of the past. The most commonly spoken language, depending on which source you consult, is either French or English on the African continent. However, there are certain parts of Africa where the history of colonialism is a little more complex and strange, especially when the colonial power dominating a region was at one point not one from Europe, but from somewhere else altogether. Now, in practical usage, colonialism and the word imperialism are often used interchangeably, the idea being that both represent the conquest and exploitation of one group by another. However, there is a bit of a distinction to be had, in that colonialism technically only refers to an overseas colony, a piece of land that is geographically isolated from the colonizing nation or metropole, but still exploited for the metropole's gain. Of course, we've seen plenty of examples of imperialism on the show, since we tend to, cover empires. However, we have seen only a few examples of colonial empires outside of Europe. Aksum would be the best example we've covered on this show, with their vast overseas conquests in Yemen. You could even make an argument that Kilwa at its height was something of a colonial metropole, establishing and growing wealthy from its overseas colonies and tributaries like Sofala and Mafia. And ironically enough, the Kilwa Sultanate is ultimately going to find its history extinguished at the hand of one of the most fascinating and unique, but also widely forgotten colonial empires, the Omani Empire. Of course, in order to understand the final fall of Kilwa, we'll have to also understand the rise of this unique institution. Since Oman isn't in Africa, we'll have to cover the topic in a more summary-esque manner than I typically prefer, but let's get into it. The nation of Oman has been seen a couple of times in this season already, though largely in passing. The nation is located on the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula, and was also experiencing an immense period of flux during the early 16th century. For centuries, Omani politics have been defined by a conflict rooted deep in Oman's history. Early in Oman's history, the region had been united under an elected imam, who served as the primary earthly authority in the Ibadi school of Islam that dominated the region. However, and warning, big oversimplification incoming, this power gradually eroded throughout the Middle Ages, as small hereditary kingdoms and city-states began to sprout up, as tribal families and local nobility started to exert an ever-growing influence over many of the regions within Oman. Soon, the imam found his influence limited only to an area within the interior mountains. This status quo remained relatively in place for centuries, with various dynasties rising and falling in Oman's many coastal cities, while certain emirs in the interior were able to win greater support from the imam, and sometimes even claimed the title of sultan, though the extent to which this represented any form of concrete power varied a lot by era. Much of the coast was still independent of the sultan's authority, and many of the smaller coastal city-states were essentially made into subjects of more powerful neighboring kingdoms, such as the Seljuk Turks or the nearby kingdom of Hormuz. However, this status quo was about to change forever. Shortly after the Portuguese had first arrived in East Africa and sacked Kilwa, they then turned their attention north and planned to continue their expansion throughout the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese soon arrived on the ports of Oman and began attacking and capturing numerous cities. Eventually, they landed at the most significant port on the Omani coast, the city of Muscat. In 1507, after bombarding the city from the sea, Portuguese soldiers landed and sacked Muscat before constructing a fort and declaring it as the newest conquest in their growing Indian Ocean empire. A story that has quite the familiarity, for sure. For the next century, Oman entered a protracted period of chaos, internal conflict, and civil war. The Portuguese remained dominant in the region's coastal cities, while the interior was preoccupied by the civil conflicts between various tribal families, dynasties, and religious leaders. However, this period of conflict eventually came to a head after more than a century, when a new, prominent leader emerged in the interior of Oman. By 1624, a new imam of Oman was elected, a man named Nasir ibn Mushid. Now, Ibn Mushid would make it a priority to unite the disparate factions of the interior of Oman, fighting several major wars to transform the rule of the imam from fiction back into reality. After uniting the interior under his rule, Nasir ibn Mushid turned his army's focus to kicking the Portuguese out of coastal Oman and began to attack a few of their coastal forts. The Omanis found limited success in this venture. They captured a few smaller Portuguese forts, but struggled to take the more substantial urban fortifications. After all, while the Omanis had built an army on land, the Portuguese were able to constantly resupply their forts by sea. Nasir ibn Mushid began to emphasize the creation of something that would be necessary to capture these cities: a powerful Omani navy, one capable of challenging Portugal's dominance on the high seas. Oman began to launch operations to capture Portuguese vessels, and soon began to build new ships based on a combination of the Portuguese and local designs. By 1650, the Omanis, with their newly empowered navy, captured the last Portuguese fort in Muscat, officially driving Portugal out of Oman. However, the Omanis' conflict with the Portuguese was not done yet. Even with the Portuguese now kicked out of their country, merchants from coastal Oman found themselves continually unable to trade on the Indian Ocean, impeded by the Portuguese's monopolies on their forts in India. Soon, the Omani war with Portugal expanded beyond Oman's shores, as Omani ships began attacking Portuguese forts on the Indian subcontinent. Soon, Oman was emerging as a formidable maritime power in its own right, one capable and successful in challenging Portuguese dominance, and soon finding itself at the head of a burgeoning colonial empire. Omani expansion in modern India and Pakistan continued, but the attention of Oman's merchants soon took a turn southward. For the last several decades, Oman had largely unsuccessfully tried to uproot the Portuguese from East Africa, but the tide had turned by 1696. That year, the Omani Navy confronted the Portuguese at one of their most important East African territories, the city of Mombasa in modern-day Kenya. Now, what exactly led to this confrontation is unclear. Omani sources claim that a local king invited them to drive the Portuguese out of the city, while Portuguese sources claim that it was a less scrupulous endeavor, with the Omanis simply being interested in taking their place as the dominant power in the region. Mombasa featured a substantial defensive castle called Fort Jesus, among the most powerful forts that the Portuguese had constructed in the entirety of the Indian Ocean. But, as it turned out, regardless of why Oman had launched the attack, the result was the same. It seemed like the Portuguese had been caught off guard. Multiple enemies, including Oman itself, had attempted to capture the fort and failed in the past, so the Portuguese had not been prepared to set up naval resupply routes to Fort Jesus. After a brutal multi-year siege, the Omanis had forced the Portuguese to surrender Fort Jesus for the first time. Having proven that they could besiege a prominent Portuguese fortification even across the distant sea, Oman began to embark on a series of battles, further challenging Portuguese authority in East Africa. They hopped to Zanzibar, then to Pemba. Portugal's East African territories fell one by one. Slowly but surely, Oman had not only defeated Portugal, driving them all the way as south as Mozambique Island, but also assumed their place as the colonial masters of the bulk of East Africa. By 1700, the Omani fleet first arrived in Kilwa, Kisiwani. The Portuguese were expelled from the island, and they captured Kilwa in the name of the Imam of Oman. By the time that the Omanis captured Kilwa, the island had long since seen better days. Since the Maravi sack and the subsequent return of Portuguese authority to the island, Kilwa had returned to its status as being an entrepot of secondary importance at the very best. It was outshone by more significant regions within the Portuguese sphere like Mozambique Island, Malindi, and Mombasa for decades. Throughout the entirety of the 17th century, few new buildings had been constructed, and the population still had far from recovered from its peak. With all this in mind, the reaction from Kilwa towards the newly arrived Omani forces was decidedly mixed. On the one hand, some elements of Kilwa society took on a celebratory tone. After all, the Portuguese, who had done so much to destroy Kilwa's prosperity, were now gone. The Queen of Kilwa, in a letter written in 1709, insisted, maybe a little optimistically, that life under Omani rule would improve. After all, the Omanis were Muslim, and clearly they would pledge to be kinder to the population of Kilwa than the Catholic Portuguese had been. However, it's worth noting that this opinion was far from ubiquitous among Kilwa's elites. An important bit of context is that the Queen of Kilwa was writing this letter to various princes from Kilwa who had fled the island following the Omani invasion. Many of them had headed over to Mozambique to go and live with the Portuguese. As their actions implied, many of Kilwa's elites had grown more concerned about the Omanis than the Portuguese. Some of them had even become downright allies and cooperated heavily with the Portuguese. By this point, the Portuguese relationship with Kilwa had grown quite complicated. Despite the fact that Portugal was for sure far from trustworthy, they were seen as a potentially useful ally in repelling threats like, the Omanis. Who's to say that the Omanis will be any better than the Portuguese? It's worth noting that in one of the replies that the Queen received to her letter, one of the nobles wrote back and notably described the Omanis as Arabs, while distinguishing the noble family of Kilwa as Swahilis. This is a very big deal, as it is the oldest written reference we have from Swahili people themselves, viewing themselves as a distinct group from the rest of the Islamic world. That they were not merely Muslims, they were not Arabs, they were not anyone else, they were their own people. And it seems like, just like everyone else who had tried to capture and annex the island, the Omanis, viewed as foreign occupiers, soon found a headache waiting for them. It's not clear what exactly happened, but by By 1710, the Omani sent their first dedicated garrison of troops to Kilwa, presumably to try and quell the inevitable outrage, interfighting, and civil war that comes every single time there's a transition of power in Kilwa's history. And soon enough, it seemed like Oman's rise would itself reverse course. By the 1730s, Oman, the seemingly invincible rising power that was surely on its way to enveloping the Indian Ocean and replacing the Portuguese as the region's dominant maritime power, found itself embroiled in a bloody succession dispute. This succession dispute of the 1730s would soon escalate into a series of full-blown civil wars, and soon Omani expansion in East Africa was put on the back burner. It was the last thing on their mind. As Oman struggled with civil wars, followed by foreign invasions from Iran, many of the regions it had captured were able to restore their sovereignty, including Kilwa. By the 1730s, Kilwa, while still ostensibly a subject of Oman, had become essentially independent once again. And as it turns out, this was perfect timing. The wars between Portugal and Oman, as well as the civil war in Oman, had weakened many of their major rivals. After all, Malindi and Mombasa had both been largely destroyed by these wars. Kilwa was once again one of the safest and most stable harbors in East Africa. Kilwa's merchants once again began to play an important role as the gateway to the hinterland of East Africa once again. They pushed deeper than ever before, trading with the peoples of the Great Lakes regions in Central Africa for unique animal pelts, ivory, and enslaved workers. Meanwhile, Kilwa was further emboldened economically by a rising diversity of European merchants present on the Indian Ocean. The region, which had once been dominated almost exclusively by Portuguese merchants, had seen a new variety of European maritime merchants taking center stage within the island. By the beginning of the 18th century, the Portuguese had been joined by the Dutch, British, French, Danish, and other numerous merchants. Now independent once again, Kilwa was again free to trade with whichever nation gave them the best offers. In 1776, the Sultan of Kilwa signed a treaty with a French merchant known only as Maurice, securing a friendly and prosperous economic relationship with the French. For the first time in centuries, Kilwa began to see a return of prosperity, including the rebuilding of some of its older buildings and the construction of new ones. Throughout the 18th century, Kilwa Kisiwani saw many new homes built and many old homes repaired. While the Great Mosque was too ambitious and remained in ruin, repairs took place on many others, including the smaller 15th century Malindi Mosque. This mosque, which had originally been built by a family from Malindi, had a storied history all its own, and the effort to rebuild it showcases how Kilwa itself, even in this early period, even in the 18th century, was already aware and interested of its important historical legacy. As the Malindi Mosque was repaired, the builders chose to include a small engraving, paying tribute to the original builders and acknowledging the historic nature of the mosque. Yes, even in the 18th century, the people of Kilwa were already interested in preserving their storied history. However, the grandest new project in the 18th century Kilwa was the construction of a new royal palace, known as the Makutani Palace. Built on the ruined foundation of a larger 15th century palace, the building was in many ways a perfect representation of this unusual time in Kilwa's history. The 18th century recovery was, honestly, a far cry from the sheer grandiosity of Kilwa's past. Its buildings were smaller than those of its classical period, but they still showcase a strong resilience and pride. The fact that Kilwa's Sultan chose to build Makutani on top of an older palace showcases how Kilwa, even at this time, was aware of its proud past and interested in building on its legacy. Even back then, Kilwa's proud past was a source of inspiration and a goal to which Kilwa's leaders aspired. By 1771, Kilwa had decided to transform its independence from Oman from a de facto reality into a publicly undeniable fact. That year, a delegation from Oman arrived in Kilwa, only for the Sultan to inform them that, for the foreseeable future, Omani presence in Kilwa would only be tolerated as merchants. The Omani governor of Kilwa, who had varyingly lived on and off the island and had largely been a ceremonial role by this point anyways, was soon deported back to Muscat. Kilwa was sovereign once again. But as it turned out, this independence would also be short-lived. In reality, Kilwa had little in terms of international backers to support its independence, and, by this point, was little more than a small, albeit slightly disproportionately wealthy island in the Indian Ocean. By the beginning of the 19th century, Oman's civil wars finally came to an end. The nation, now ruled by a sultanate, made its return to East Africa, eager to expand and reassert its power over the region. Kilwa Kisiwani was among the first of the territories over which Oman sought to reassert its influence. Sending an armed convoy of soldiers, the Omanis once again captured the island with little resistance. This time, they erected a large stone castle as a show of force. Kilwa was now a vassal of Oman again, and this time, they weren't going anywhere. As the second period of Omani rule set in, Kilwa's economy once again began to stagnate and suffer, even harder than in previous periods. This time, the real killer for Kilwa was the growing competition between their island and an ever more important locale. Just to the north, the island of Zanzibar was growing extremely important. Once an island of secondary importance on the East African coast, Zanzibar began to attract a degree of Omani attention and investment like nowhere else in their colonial empire. Due to its plentiful fresh water supplies, natural harbors on its western coast, and easy access to the trade routes of interior East Africa, Zanzibar soon became the de facto center of the Omani imperial economy. The island had plentiful access to enslaved labor from the interior, while the trade in ivory, gold, and other opulent goods made the island extraordinarily wealthy. However, the biggest investment came in the opening decades of the 19th century. Cloves, which come from a bud of species of tree native to Indonesia, were among the most valuable spices on the planet. Used widely in cuisines and medicine around the world, the demand for cloves was astronomical, and its supply was extremely low. At the time, they were grown only on a few islands in Indonesia and a couple French colonies in the Indian Ocean. Omani merchants saw the potential wealth that it could bring and soon smuggled the product to Zanzibar, where they sought to produce the spice at a truly competitive scale for the first time. Utilizing enslaved labor from the interior of East Africa, Zanzibar soon found itself home, the largest in history to that point. At their height, Zanzibar produced over 4/5 of global clove supply. The island soon became an enormous financial center, with investors and merchants alike, especially those from India, congregating in Zanzibar to engage in speculation on various luxury products. As Zanzibar was ascending to become the wealthy, and at the same time that Zanzibar was ascending to become one of the wealthiest trade and financial hubs in the world, Kilwa was experiencing a very different fate. Now dramatically overshadowed by its northern neighbor, Kilwa's status as an important trade hub was essentially gone. Meanwhile, a new problem for Kilwa emerged. Here's a throwback to Season 4 of all places. A new power from Madagascar was beginning to make its own presence felt on the Indian Ocean. The Sakalava people of northern Madagascar, under increasing pressure from their expanding Medina neighbors, began to launch a series of naval raids to the north. These raids, which primarily targeted the Comoros Islands at first, eventually reached as far north as Kilwa and Mafia Island by 1816. The Omanis, not especially invested in defending this distant island of tertiary importance, did little to protect the locals from Sakalava raids. After several uninterrupted days of raiding, the population of Kilwa was devastated once again. Eventually, the final nail in the coffin for Kilwa arrived. Omani rulers had began to hear rumblings and rumors of a problem in their distant colony of Kilwa. According to some of their spies on the island, the French had recently taken a very serious interest in acquiring the island. The Sultan of Kilwa, a man simply known as Hassan, had chafed under Omani rule for the entirety of his reign, and, now eager to return any semblance of significance to his kingdom, was mulling over the French offer with sincerity. After all, French had played an important role in propelling Kilwa back to significance a few decades earlier. Maybe under the French, Kilwa's prosperity could return. Of course, this was never going to be allowed to happen. The Sultan of Oman intervened almost immediately, sent another force to the island, captured the Sultan of Kilwa, and exiled him to Muscat. With no heirs living on Kilwa, the royal family was soon extinct, and the Sultanate was forever abolished. Following the end of their Sultanate, Kilwa would change hands several more times over history. By the end of the 19th century, the territory of the Omani Empire was among the many African states divided between those of European empires. The industrially fueled period of colonial expansion had emerged. By this time, the Omani Empire had come to rely so heavily on their territories in East Africa that a large section had essentially broken away and become the Sultanate of Zanzibar. The remnants of this sultanate and its successor states were split between the British, Germans, and Belgians. Kilwa Kisiwani, now under German colonial control, was little more than a strange curiosity, an obscure island and harbor of little contemporary importance to the colonial masters, and yet one that was home to ruins that showed that it had once been much more. In many ways, this still reflects Kilwa's status today. Empires rise and fall. The German Empire in the region was soon replaced by the British, who soon thereafter left as Kilwa became part of the newly independent Republic of Tanzania. As of the recording of this episode, Kilwa Kisiwani remains one of the most unique and fascinating places on planet Earth. Today, the island hosts a community of little over 1,000 people, still shockingly a small fraction of the number that populated Kilwa during its medieval height. Even now, as public consciousness of the breathtaking historic civilization that the island hosted becomes more widely known than ever before, Kilwa remains pretty obscure, receiving far fewer tourists than, an average city anywhere. Despite its enormously influential past, its breathtaking ruins, Kilwa is not a tourist trap to this day. The civilization that Kilwa hosted and hosts today is not some dead relic of the past. There are still people there today, direct descendants of the Sultanate of Kilwa, still carrying on its legacy. In many ways, modern Kilwa is much like the Makutani Palace. The island carries a historical prestige from its distant past. Its people still live in the shadows of the gigantic legacy that their ancestors left behind. And yet, much like the palace built on the foundation of the past, Kilwa's people continue to live that history as we speak. They do not seek to return to the past, nor to bury it, but rather to honor it by building a new future for themselves on the foundation of what came before. And with all that said, I'd like to thank you all so much for coming with me on this adventure through Kilwa's history. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about this stuff, and I can't wait to get started on the next one. As is tradition, our next season will follow the cycle of regionalism that we always have. North, east, west, south. We're going to be heading to West Africa. And as chosen by a democratic vote from our patrons on Patreon, we're going to be exploring the fascinating history of one of the most underrated empires in West Africa. Join us in our next season as we explore the history of the Wolof Empire and what it can tell us about the fascinating tales in Senegalese history.